The charity gala at the Art Institute of Chicago was the social event of the season, a sea of black ties and diamonds under the vaulted ceilings. Lucas stood by the ice sculpture, nursing a drink, trying to hide his rough, calloused hands in his pockets, until he heard his wife, Emily, laughing across the room, a laugh that wasn't joyful, but cruel. She was leaning into the arm of Victor Sterling, a real estate mogul, and as she whispered a joke about marrying beneath her station, her hand slid possessively down Victor's lapel. The air in the room didn't change, but for Lucas, the oxygen simply vanished, replaced by the suffocating realization that he was no longer a husband, but a punchline. If you want to witness the moment a man's heart hardens into steel and the long, satisfying arc of justice, stay with me. The wind off Lake Michigan was a physical assault, a razor-sharp gust that cut through the heavy wool of Lucas Bennett's tuxedo coat as he stepped out of the cab. But the cold outside was nothing compared to the temperature inside the grand ballroom of the Art Institute of Chicago. "Fix your tie," Emily hissed, not looking at him. She was busy checking her reflection in the glass doors of the entrance. Her dress was a severe, architectural column of black silk that cost more than the machinery in Lucas's workshop. "And for God's sake, keep your hands in your pockets. You still have stain under your fingernails." Lucas looked down at his hands. He had scrubbed them with turpentine and pumice soap for 20 minutes before putting on the suit. They were clean, but they were working hands, broad, scarred, and permanently etched with the map of his labor. "I scrubbed them, Lucas said quietly. "It's Emily tonight," she corrected, flashing a dazzling, practiced smile at the doorman as they walked in. "Victor hates nicknames. He says they're plebeian." Victor. The name hung in the air like smoke. Victor Sterling was the billionaire developer who had single-handedly funded the new wing of the gallery Emily directed. For the past 6 months, his name was the only thing Lucas heard over dinner. "Victor likes this concept. Victor hates that artist. Victor thinks we should vacation in St. Bart's." The gala was a blinding swirl of crystal chandeliers, aggressive modern art, and people who looked like they had never touched a rough surface in their lives. Lucas felt the familiar tightness in his chest, the feeling of being an imposter in his wife's world. He was a master carpenter, a man who could coax a soul out of a block of walnut. But here, he was just Emily's husband. They circulated the room. Lucas played his part, nodding when appropriate, holding Emily's clutch when she needed both hands to gesture. Then, they reached the VIP circle near the champagne tower. Victor Sterling was holding court. He was a tall man, silver-haired and impeccably preserved, wearing a tuxedo that fit him like a second skin. "Emily," Victor's voice boomed. He ignored the other guests and zeroed in on her. "The curator of the hour. This exhibit is a triumph." "Thank you, Victor," Emily practically purred, stepping into his personal space. "We couldn't have done it without your vision." Victor's eyes slid to Lucas. They were cold, calculating eyes, like a shark assessing a seal. "And this must be the husband," Victor said, extending a hand. Lucas took it. His grip was firm, conditioned by years of handling oak and iron. Victor flinched slightly, then smirked. "Strong grip," Victor noted, wiping his hand discreetly on a napkin. "What is it you do, Mr. Bennett? Emily keeps you quite hidden." "I'm a carpenter," Lucas said, his voice steady. "I build custom furniture." The silence was instantaneous. A woman nearby covered her mouth with a gloved hand. In this circle, people were consultants, directors, investors. They didn't build things. Victor chuckled. It wasn't a kind sound. "A carpenter. Like Jesus, but with a worse tailor." "How?" "Rustic." Lucas felt the heat rise in his neck. He waited for Emily to defend him. He waited for her to say, "He's an artist. He builds heirlooms." Instead, Emily laughed. It was a sharp, brittle sound that shattered Lucas's heart. She placed a hand on Victor's forearm, her fingers lingering on the expensive fabric. "Oh, stop it, Victor," she giggled, leaning into him. "You make it sound so serious. It's just a little hobby of his. He likes to play with wood in the garage. Keeps him out of trouble while the adults are working." A little hobby. Lucas looked at his wife. He saw the way she looked at Victor, with admiration, with hunger. He saw the way Victor looked at her, with ownership. And he saw the way Emily's thumb was absent-mindedly stroking the lapel of Victor's jacket. It was an intimate, unconscious gesture. A gesture a woman makes to a lover, not a donor. The room spun. The chatter of the gala faded into a dull roar. The champagne in his stomach turned to acid. "I see," Victor said, his eyes locking with Lucas's, a challenge clear in his gaze. "Well, everyone needs a hobby. I collect buildings. You collect splinters." Emily laughed again, throwing her head back, exposing her long, elegant neck. Lucas didn't say a word. He didn't make a scene. He simply realized, with a clarity that hurt more than any saw blade, that he was done. He reached into his pocket, pulled out the claim check for his coat, and dropped it into Emily's clutch. "Lucas," Emily whispered, her smile faltering as she noticed his expression. "What are you doing? Don't be rude." "I'm going home, Emily," Lucas said. His voice was so low only she could hear it. "Enjoy the adults. I have some wood to play with. If you walk out that door," she hissed, her eyes narrowing, "don't expect me to be there when you wake up." Lucas looked at Victor, then back at his wife. "I don't expect you to be there, Emily. I don't think you've been there for a long time." He turned and walked away. The crowd parted for him, not out of respect, but out of confusion. He walked past the ice sculpture, past the security guards, and pushed open the heavy glass doors. The Chicago wind hit him immediately, a wall of freezing air. He didn't have his coat. He didn't care. He loosened his tie, unbuttoned his collar, and began to walk into the driving snow. The cold bit at his skin, numbing the pain, freezing the tears before they could fall. He walked toward the train station, leaving the warmth, the lies, and the woman he used to love behind in the gilded cage. The revolving door of the Art Institute settled into stillness behind him, severing the connection between the two worlds. Inside, the air was perfumed with orchids and entitlement. Outside, the Chicago winter was a living, breathing beast. The wind, screaming off Lake Michigan, hit Lucas with the force of a physical blow, instantly piercing the thin fabric of his tuxedo shirt. He stood on the steps for a moment, the snow swirling around him in chaotic, blinding sheets. A line of yellow taxis waited near the curb, their engines idling, exhaust plumes rising like gray ghosts into the dark. He reached into his pocket and felt his wallet. He had enough for a cab. He could be back at their condo in the Gold Coast in 15 minutes. He could turn up the heat, pour a drink, and wait for Emily to come home so they could have the fight that had been brewing for 5 years. But the thought of that pristine, white-walled apartment made his stomach turn. Every piece of furniture in that place he had built with his own hands. The walnut dining table where she sat on her phone during dinner. The oak bed frame where they slept back to back, miles apart. Those objects were no longer symbols of his love. They were monuments to his foolishness. He turned away from the taxis. He didn't want to go home. He didn't have a home. Lucas began to walk. He headed south, away from the glittering skyline of the Loop, toward the darker, grittier veins of the city. The wind chill was well below zero. Within blocks, the sensation in his ears and nose began to fade, replaced by a stinging numbness. His dress shoes, polished to a mirror shine for Emily's approval, had zero traction on the ice-slicked sidewalk. He slipped, caught himself on a freezing metal lamppost, and kept moving. He replayed the scene in the ballroom over and over, a torture loop in his mind. Just a little hobby. It wasn't the insult that killed him, it was the casualness of it. It was the way she had erased his identity to fit into Victor Sterling's pocket. He walked past the closed storefronts of State Street. The holiday decorations were still up, mocking him with their cheer. A homeless man huddled in a doorway, wrapped in layers of blankets, looked up as Lucas passed. The man saw a figure in a tuxedo walking through a blizzard without a coat and didn't ask for change. He just watched, recognizing a different kind of poverty. Lucas's hands, buried deep in his pockets, were clenched into fists so tight his knuckles ached. He thought about the cradle. It was sitting on his workbench right now, covered in a tarp. He had started it 3 months ago, when Emily had mentioned, briefly, fleetingly, that maybe they should start thinking about a family. He had selected the wood with reverence, a rare cherry timber he had been saving for years. He had hand-planed every curve, sanding it until it was soft as silk. A hobby. He walked for an hour. Then two. The city changed around him. The skyscrapers gave way to low-rise brick buildings, warehouses, and the industrial skeletons of old Chicago. The streets here weren't plowed. The snow was ankle-deep, soaking his socks, turning his feet into blocks of ice. He was shivering violently now, his teeth chattering with a rhythm he couldn't control, but the physical pain was grounding. It was real. It was honest. Unlike the smile on his wife's face. Finally, he saw it. The rusted corrugated metal sign of the old packing district. He turned down a narrow alleyway, flanked by brick walls covered in graffiti that was muted by the snow. At the end of the alley stood a heavy steel door with a small, singular light bulb flickering above it. His workshop. Lucas fumbled with his keys, his fingers so stiff they felt like foreign objects. He dropped the keys into the snow, fell to his knees to find them, and for a second, he didn't want to get up. The snow was soft. It would be so easy to just stay there, to let the cold finish what Emily had started. But the anger pulled him up, a hot, molten core of rage that the winter couldn't touch. He found the key, jammed it into the lock, and turned it. The heavy tumblers clicked, a heavy, mechanical sound that felt like a greeting. He shoved the door open and stumbled inside. The air in the workshop was freezing, only a few degrees warmer than the outside, but it smelled of sawdust, linseed oil, and varnish. It smelled of labor. It smelled of truth. Lucas slammed the door shut against the wind and locked it. He didn't turn on the overhead lights. The street lamp outside cast long, skeletal shadows through the high windows. He stood in the center of the shop, shivering, water dripping from his hair onto the concrete floor. He was surrounded by his tools. The bandsaw, the planer, the rows of chisels hanging on the wall like soldiers. They didn't care about his bank account. They didn't care about Victor Sterling. They only cared about his hands. He stripped off the wet tuxedo jacket and threw it onto the floor. He tore at the bow tie, ripping it loose, and let it fall. He walked over to the wood stove in the corner, his movements jerky and desperate. He grabbed a handful of scrap wood and kindling, struck a match with shaking fingers, and lit the fire. As the flames caught, casting a dancing orange light across the room, Lucas turned to look at the far corner of the shop. There, under a gray canvas tarp, sat the cradle. He stared at it for a long time. The heat from the stove began to thaw his skin, bringing the pain of returning circulation, but his eyes remained cold. He walked toward the tarp, his footsteps echoing in the silence. The tarp slid off with a heavy rustle, pooling on the concrete floor like a discarded skin. Underneath, the cherrywood glowed in the firelight, warm and rich. It was a masterpiece. Lucas had spent 3 months on it, stealing hours late at night, while Emily was at gallery openings or dinner parties. He had cut the dovetails by hand, ensuring the joints were seamless, tight, and unbreakable. He had sanded the curves of the rockers until they felt like water against the fingertips. He had rubbed it with 6 coats of tung oil, bringing out the deep, reddish hue of the grain without burying it under plastic lacquer. It was built to hold a life. It was built to be passed down. Now, it looked like a coffin for a ghost. Lucas ran his hand along the rim. The wood was cold. He closed his eyes and saw the image of Emily again, leaning into Victor, laughing. A quaint little hobby. She hadn't just insulted his skill, she had invalidated his soul. She viewed his labor, the sweat, the blood, the precision, as something cute, something trivial, something beneath her. He looked at the cradle, and for the first time, he didn't see a bed for a future child. He saw his own stupidity. He saw a man who had built a throne for a queen who saw him as a court jester. A sudden, guttural roar ripped from his throat, a sound so raw it startled him. Lucas turned and grabbed a heavy mallet from the workbench. The handle was smooth hickory, familiar and solid. He didn't hesitate. He didn't let himself think. He swung the mallet with all the force of his freezing, aching body. Crack. The sound was sickeningly loud in the empty warehouse. The mallet struck the delicate spindle on the side of the cradle, snapping the dry cherry wood like a twig. He swung again, and again, He attacked the cradle with a calculated frenzy. He wasn't just breaking wood. He was breaking the years of silence. He was smashing the nights he sat alone waiting for her to come home. He was crushing the apologies he had made for things he hadn't done. He was destroying the man who had stood there in a tuxedo, holding her purse, while she flirted with another man. A spindle flew across the room, skittering across the concrete. The beautifully curved rocker split down the grain. The headboard, with the intricate carving of a sleeping bear he had spent weeks perfecting, shattered into 3 jagged pieces. He didn't stop until the cradle was nothing but a pile of debris at his feet. Breathing hard, sweat mixing with the melted snow on his forehead, Lucas dropped the mallet. His hands were shaking, but the tightness in his chest, the crushing weight that had been there since the gala, was gone. In its place was a hollow, cold clarity. He bent down and picked up a shard of the cherry wood. The grain was jagged, the edge sharp. He walked over to the wood stove. The fire was roaring now, hungry and bright. He opened the iron door. The heat blasted his face, drying the tears he hadn't realized he was crying. One by one, he fed the pieces of the cradle into the fire. He watched the flames lick at the oil-finished wood. He watched the cherry turn black, then white, crumbling into ash. He watched his dream burn. It didn't smell like tragedy. It smelled like smoke and heat. It smelled like survival. When the last piece was gone, Lucas closed the stove door. He was exhausted, a bone-deep weariness that made his knees tremble. He looked around the shop. It was a mess. Sawdust, scraps, tools scattered on the bench. It was freezing in the corners where the stove's heat didn't reach. There was no bed, only an old, dusty sofa in the office partition that smelled of stale coffee. There was no kitchen, only a hot plate and a sink stained with paint. It was miles away from the penthouse on the Gold Coast. It was ugly. It was rough. But as Lucas locked the heavy steel bolts of the front door and dragged the old sofa closer to the stove, he realized something. The air here was his. The silence was his. He took off his wet shirt and wrapped himself in a scratchy wool blanket he kept for emergencies. He lay down on the lumpy cushions, staring up at the dark, corrugated steel ceiling. The wind howled outside, battering the walls, but inside, the fire crackled steadily. He was alone. He had no money, no coat, and his marriage was ash in a stove. But as his eyes drifted shut, Lucas Bennett didn't feel afraid. He felt the hard, cold resolve of a man who had nothing left to lose, and therefore, nothing left to fear. Tomorrow, he would work. The morning light that filtered through the high, grime-streaked windows of the warehouse was not the golden glow of a new beginning. It was gray, flat, and merciless. It illuminated the dust motes dancing in the freezing air and the pile of ash in the cold stove where the cradle had been. Lucas woke up with a stiffness that went down to his bones. The wool blanket was rough against his skin, and his neck ached from the lumpy sofa cushions. For a split second, in the haze of waking, he reached out his hand, expecting to find the high thread count sheets of his bed and the warmth of his wife. His hand hit the cold metal of a filing cabinet. The memory of the night before crashed down on him. The gala, the laughter, the blizzard, the fire. He sat up, rubbing his face with his calloused palms. He was hungry, he was cold, and he was still wearing his tuxedo trousers and a stained undershirt. He made coffee on the hot plate, the bitter smell filling the small office partition. He drank it black, staring out at the workshop floor. It was silent, waiting. At 10 a.m., there was a sharp rap on the steel door. Lucas didn't move fast. He walked across the concrete floor, his boots heavy. He slid the bolt back and pushed the door open. A bike messenger stood there, shivering in a neon yellow jacket, his nose red from the biting wind. He held a thick manila envelope. "Lucas Bennett?" the kid asked, shifting his weight. "Yeah. Sign here." Lucas scrawled his name on the digital pad. The kid thrust the envelope into his hands and turned to leave, eager to get back to the warmth of his next destination. "Wait," Lucas said. "Who is this from?" The kid shrugged, already mounting his bike. "Law firm. Sterling and Associates. Urgent delivery." Sterling. Lucas closed the door and locked it. He walked back to his workbench, the envelope feeling like a lead weight in his hand. He cleared a space among the chisels and sandpaper and dumped the contents out. A stack of legal documents slid across the scarred wood. Petition for dissolution of marriage. He stared at the words. They were so clean, so formal. Times New Roman, 12-point font. The bold heading at the top listed the petitioner, Emily Bennett. But it was the address below her name that stopped his heart. It wasn't their condo on the Gold Coast. It was 110 North Wacker Drive, Penthouse B. The Sterling Tower. Lucas let out a breath that was half laugh, half groan. She hadn't even waited 24 hours. Or perhaps she had been planning this for months, waiting for the right moment to pull the trigger. The gala wasn't the cause, it was just the excuse. She had moved straight from their bed into Victor's, and she was using Victor's lawyers to wipe Lucas off the map. He flipped through the pages. The terms were brutal in their simplicity. She kept the condo. She kept the bank accounts. She kept the car. In exchange, she graciously allowed him to keep sole ownership of Bennett Custom Woodworking and all debts associated therein. There was a check clipped to the last page. $10,000. A settlement fee. It was payoff money. It was the price of a used car or a bad mistake. She was buying his silence and his disappearance. Lucas looked at the check. He could use it. He had bills for the shop, suppliers to pay, and he was currently homeless. He picked up a carpenter's pencil. The lead was thick and flat. He didn't call a lawyer. He didn't text Emily to scream at her. He knew, with a sickening certainty, that she wouldn't answer. She would be drinking mimosas in Penthouse B, looking at the lake, relieved that the embarrassment was finally being handled by the professionals. If he fought this, it would drag on for months. He would have to see her in court. He would have to hear her lawyers describe his business as a failing hobby. He would have to listen to Victor Sterling testify about how he was supporting Emily. He couldn't do it. He wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing him bleed anymore. Lucas flipped to the signature page. He didn't even read the rest of the clauses. He pressed the pencil down hard, the graphite biting into the paper. Lucas Bennett. Then he took the check. He held it up to the gray light. $10,000 for 5 years of his life. He struck a match and set the corner of the check on fire. He held it until the flames scorched his fingertips, then dropped the burning paper onto the concrete floor, stepping on the ashes with his heavy boot. He put the signed papers back in the envelope and tossed it onto the outgoing mail pile. It was done. He was divorced. He was broke. He was alone. Lucas looked up. The silence of the workshop was no longer oppressive. It was expectant. The tools were waiting. The wood was waiting. He walked over to the rack of lumber against the wall. He pulled down a heavy slab of rough-sawn walnut. It was heavy, rough, and ugly on the outside. But inside, he knew there was something strong. He carried the wood to the table saw. He put on his safety glasses and ear protection. The world narrowed down to the measurement, the line, and the blade. He hit the power button. The saw roared to life, a high-pitched scream that drowned out the wind outside, drowned out the memory of her laugh, and drowned out the silence of the empty room. Lucas pushed the wood into the blade. The sawdust flew into the air, smelling of earth and time. He didn't look back. Time in the warehouse did not pass in days or weeks. It passed in layers of sawdust and gallons of varnish. 2 years had bled into the concrete floor, staining it alongside the walnut and oak. Lucas had become a ghost in his own city. He stopped going to the north side. He stopped reading the society pages where Emily's face occasionally appeared, usually smiling next to Victor Sterling at some ribbon-cutting ceremony. He didn't own a television. He barely owned clothes, save for his work boots and canvas pants. He worked 18 hours a day, 7 days a week. When he was too exhausted to stand, he slept on the sofa in the office. When he woke up, he worked again. His body had changed. The softness of the domestic life he'd once lived was gone, burned away by the physical demands of the shop. He was leaner, harder, his muscles corded like the steel cables of the bridges outside. His face was hidden behind a thick, dark beard that caught the dust of his labor. He looked less like a man and more like a part of the machinery. It was a Tuesday afternoon, gray and rainy, when the knock came. It wasn't the aggressive banging of a creditor or the timid knock of a delivery driver. It was firm, precise. 3 distinct raps. Lucas turned off the sander. The silence rushed back into the room, ringing in his ears. He wiped his hands on a rag and walked to the door. He wasn't expecting anyone. He didn't take clients here. He sold his pieces through a consignment shop in the West Loop that took a 40% cut, but asked no questions. He threw the bolt and opened the door. A woman stood there. She wasn't wearing a fur coat or dripping in diamonds. She wore a trench coat that had seen actual rain, boots that were made for walking, and her hair was pulled back in a severe, practical knot. She held a rolled-up set of blueprints in one hand. "Are you the one who made the console table at Foundations?" she asked. "No hello. No small talk." Lucas blinked, adjusting to the daylight. "I might be." "The joinery," she said, stepping past him into the shop without waiting for an invitation. She walked straight to a partially finished white oak chair sitting on the assembly table. It wasn't a standard mortise and tenon. It was a locking Japanese joint. I haven't seen that executed by hand in Chicago ever. She ran her hand over the unfinished wood of the chair. Her fingers were long, unadorned by rings. She touched the wood with a reverence that made Lucas's breath hitch. She didn't look at it like it was furniture. She looked at it like it was a structure. "Who are you?" Lucas asked, closing the door against the rain. "Julia," she said, turning to face him. Her eyes were sharp, intelligent, and completely devoid of the condescension he had grown used to. "I'm the lead architect for the renovation of the old post office building. We're doing the lobby." Lucas crossed his arms. "That's a big job. Union carpenters." "For the walls, yes," Julia said. "For the center, I need art. I need soul. I don't want factory-made garbage that looks good in a catalog but falls apart in 5 years." She unrolled the blueprints on his workbench, pushing aside a pile of chisels. She didn't flinch at the dust. "I need a reception desk," she said, tapping the paper. 30 feet long. Reclaimed timber. Live edge. But it has to float. It needs to look like it defies gravity. Every contractor I've talked to says it needs steel supports, ugly brackets. They want to bolt it down. She looked up at him. "I saw your table. I saw how you hid the strength inside the beauty. Can you build this without the steel?" Lucas looked at the blueprints. It was an impossible design. Massive weight, minimal contact points. It was an engineering nightmare. He felt a spark in his chest, a feeling he hadn't felt since the night he burned the cradle. It was the thrill of the challenge. "I can do it," Lucas said, his voice rough from disuse. "But I don't use screws. I don't use brackets. It's all wood on wood. Tension and compression. That's what I'm banking on," Julia said. She reached into her bag and pulled out a checkbook. "I need it in 3 months. I can pay you half now." Lucas looked at her. "You don't know my name." "I don't care about your name," Julia replied, capping her pen. "I care about your hands. I care that you're the only person in this city who understands that wood is alive." She tore off the check and placed it on the bench. It was for an amount that would cover his rent for a year. "Don't disappoint me," she said. She turned and walked out, her boots clicking on the concrete. Lucas stood there for a long time, staring at the blueprints. For 2 years, he had been building to forget. Now, looking at the complex, beautiful problem before him, he realized he had a reason to remember who he was. He wasn't Emily's husband. He wasn't a failure. He was the man who could make heavy things fly. Lucas picked up a pencil, and for the first time in 2 years, he didn't feel cold. The reception desk at the old post office didn't just defy gravity, it defied expectation. When the building opened, the massive slab of reclaimed white oak, suspended seemingly by nothing but air and tension, became the most photographed object in Chicago architectural circles. Critics called it brutally elegant. Architects called it impossibly structural. But when the wealthy patrons asked who built it, Julia simply handed them a heavy, cream-colored business card with 2 embossed letters, LB. No phone number, no address, just an email that went to a screening server. In the 3 years that followed, the legend of LB grew like ivy over a brick wall. In a world of oversharing, where every designer documented their breakfast on Instagram, LB's silence was intoxicating. He became the ultimate status symbol. Owning an LB piece meant you didn't just have money, you had access. It meant you had passed the test. Lucas stood on the iron catwalk of his warehouse, looking down at the floor. It was no longer the freezing, dusty tomb he had nearly died in. He had bought the building a year ago. The windows were sealed and cleaned. The heating system was state-of-the-art. Below him, 3 assistants, young, talented woodworkers he paid well above union rates, were carefully sanding a 20-foot dining table destined for a tech billionaire in San Francisco. Lucas took a sip of espresso. He had changed, too. The wild, desperation-fueled beard was gone, trimmed down to a close, neat shadow. He no longer wore stained t-shirts. He wore fitted charcoal sweaters and dark denim. He looked less like a laborer and more like the material he worked with, hardened, seasoned, and enduring. Julia walked up the metal stairs, the click of her heels echoing against the high ceiling. She was technically his business partner now, though she still ran her own firm. She acted as the gatekeeper, the firewall between Lucas and the world that wanted to consume him. "You turned down the hotel in Dubai," she said, leaning against the railing next to him. "They wanted gold leaf inlay," Lucas said, his voice low and calm. "On walnut. It's a crime." "They offered $500,000, Lucas." "I don't need the money," he replied, turning to walk back into his office, a glass-walled cube suspended above the workshop floor. "I need the work to mean something." It was true. The checks that flowed into his account were substantial. He had paid off the debts, bought the building, and invested quietly. He drove a vintage Porsche now, not because it was flashy, but because he appreciated the engineering. But he never drove it to the north side. He stayed in the industrial district, a king in a castle of steel and brick. "There's a waiting list," Julia said, following him. 18 months. People are offering double to jump the line. Let them wait. Anticipation builds character. Julia sat on the edge of his desk, watching him. "You know they talk about you. The rumors are ridiculous. Some say you're a monk. Some say you're an eccentric European count. No one suspects you're the guy who used to fix their cabinets." "Good," Lucas said. He picked up a caliper and measured the thickness of a drafting pencil, a nervous habit he hadn't shaken. "The moment they know I'm Lucas Bennett, the blue-collar embarrassment, the magic dies. They don't want the man. They want the mystery." He walked to the window of his office, looking out at the Chicago skyline. Somewhere in that forest of glass and steel, Emily was living the life she had traded him for. He wondered if she was happy. He wondered if the clean lines and the sterile perfection of Victor Sterling's world were enough to keep her warm at night. He didn't hate her anymore. Hate required energy. What he felt was a distant, cold pity. She was trapped in a game of appearances. He had built a reality. "One more thing," Julia said, pulling a file from her bag. Her tone shifted, becoming cautious. "We got a query this morning. Priority status. They're asking for a conference table. Centerpiece for a new headquarters." "I'm booked until next spring," Lucas dismissed. "It's for the Sterling Tower," Julia said softly. "The new expansion." Lucas froze. The name hit him like a physical blow, slicing through the layers of time and success he had built around himself. "Sterling," he repeated. "Victor Sterling specifically requested LB. He wants the best. He wants to show off." Julia paused, watching his back. "I can reject it. I can tell them you're unavailable." Lucas stared at the city. He saw the tall, black monolith of the Sterling Tower piercing the sky. He thought of the night in the snow. He thought of the laughter. He turned around slowly. His face was unreadable, a mask of stone. "No," Lucas said. "Don't reject it." "Lucas, are you sure? If you take this, you invite them in." "I'm not the same man who walked out of that gala, Julia," he said. A small, dangerous smile touched the corners of his mouth. "Victor wants a table? I'll build him a table. But he's going to have to beg for it." He walked back to his desk and opened his sketchbook. "Tell them I'll consider it," Lucas said. "But the client has to come to me. I don't do site visits." Julia smiled, recognizing the shift. "The client won't come. Victor Sterling doesn't go to warehouses." "Then he sends someone," Lucas said, his pencil hovering over the paper. "And whoever he sends, I'll be ready." The view from the 45th floor of the Sterling Tower was commanding. It reduced the chaotic sprawl of Chicago to a grid of twinkling lights, silent and distant. Emily stood before the floor-to-ceiling glass, her forehead resting against the cold pane. At 37, she was arguably more beautiful than she had been at 30, but it was a brittle, manufactured beauty. Her skin was smoothed by quarterly chemical peels. Her body was sculpted by a personal trainer Victor insisted she see 4 times a week. Her hair was a platinum shade that Victor preferred, even though it damaged the roots. She looked like a statue, perfect and lifeless. "You're wearing the red?" Victor's voice cut through the silence of the master suite. He didn't shout. He never shouted. He spoke with the quiet, terrifying authority of a man who owned the building. Emily turned. Victor was sitting in the wingback chair, reading a briefing on his tablet. He hadn't even looked up to see her. He had judged the dress from the reflection in the window. "I thought it would be festive," Emily said, her hand instinctively going to her throat. It was a vintage Valentino, striking and bold. Lucas used to tell her she looked like a movie star in red. He would look at her with eyes that were hungry, warm, and completely devoid of critique. "It's aggressive," Victor said, finally glancing up. His eyes swept over her like a scanner reading a barcode. "And it clashes with the decor of the restaurant. We're the black sheath, the one with the high neck. It's more dignity, less desperation." Emily felt the sting of tears prick the corners of her eyes, but she blinked them back instantly. Crying was messy. Victor hated messy. "Of course," she whispered. "I'll change." She walked into the walk-in closet, a space larger than the first apartment she and Lucas had shared. As she unzipped the red dress and let it pool on the floor, she felt a wave of exhaustion so heavy it nearly knocked her over. 7 years. She had been Mrs. Victor Sterling for 7 years. She had the Black American Express card. She had the seat on the symphony board. She had the envy of every woman who read the society pages. And she had never been lonelier. With Lucas, there had been sawdust on the floor and bills they sometimes juggled, but there had been laughter. There had been Sunday mornings with pancakes and bad coffee and feet tangled together under warm blankets. Lucas had loved her. Victor loved the idea of her, the trophy on his arm that signaled to the world he was still virulent, still powerful. She put on the black dress. It was restrictive, tight around the ribs. It felt like armor. When she emerged, Victor was standing by the door, checking his watch. "Better," he said, offering her his arm. He didn't tell her she looked beautiful. He just acknowledged that she was now appropriate for public consumption. "We need to discuss the headquarters project in the car. The interior design team is failing me." "I thought the designs were promising," Emily ventured as they walked to the private elevator. "They are pedestrian," Victor snapped. "I am building a legacy, Emily. I am building the tallest residential spire in the Midwest. I cannot fill the lobby with mass-produced garbage." The elevator doors slid shut, sealing them in the mirrored box. "I want a centerpiece," Victor continued, staring at his own reflection. "I've been reading about this designer. LB, the critics are obsessed with him. He's elusive, arrogant, expensive." Emily nodded. She had heard the name. LB Designs was the current obsession of the art world. Minimalist, structural, profound. She had tried to get a piece for the gallery last year, but her emails had been ignored. "I want him," Victor said. "I want a conference table for the executive boardroom. 40 feet. Something that says power. But his people are stonewalling my assistant. They say he's booked until 2030. Victor turned to her. His eyes were cold, hard flint. "You're the art expert, Emily. That's why I keep you around, isn't it? For your taste?" The insult was wrapped in a question, subtle and sharp. "That's why I keep you around. Like a pet. Like a piece of furniture." "I can reach out," Emily said, keeping her voice steady. "I have contacts." "Don't just reach out," Victor said, stepping closer to her, invading her space until she could smell his expensive cologne and the scotch on his breath. "Get it done. Go to his studio. Charm him. Bribe him. I don't care. I want that table, and I want it before the shareholders' meeting next month." The elevator dinged, signaling their arrival at the garage. "Consider it a test of your continued utility," Victor added with a thin, humorless smile. He walked out toward the waiting limousine, expecting her to follow. Emily stood in the elevator for a second longer, her heart hammering against the tight black silk. She remembered Lucas again. She remembered how, when she had a bad day at the gallery, he would make her tea, rub her feet with his rough, strong hands, and listen to her complain for hours. He never tested her utility. He just loved her. She stepped out of the elevator, her heels clicking on the concrete, following the man she had chosen. She had traded the sawdust for diamonds, but tonight, the diamonds felt like a chain around her neck. She would get Victor his table. She would find this LB, whoever he was, and she would beg if she had to. Because in Victor Sterling's world, failure was not an option, and neither was divorce. For 3 days, Emily Bennett, or Emily Sterling, as the letterhead on her desk declared, had been hitting a wall made of silence. She was used to doors opening before she even reached for the handle. A phone call from her assistant usually sufficed to clear restaurants, secure front-row seats, or arrange private viewings of masterworks. The name, Sterling, was a skeleton key that unlocked the city. But LB didn't care about keys. Emily sat in her office at the gallery, surrounded by files. She had called every interior design firm in Chicago. She had harassed curators in New York. She had even tried to bribe an architectural critic from the Tribune to give up a phone number. The result was nothing. LB Designs had no phone number, no public address, no press representative, just a generic email address. Inquiries at lbstudio.com. It was infuriating. It was arrogant. And, God help her, it was brilliant. By making himself inaccessible, this designer had turned furniture into a holy grail. Victor asked her every night over dinner, his voice devoid of inflection, "Do we have a meeting yet?" And every night, she had to swallow her pride and say, "I'm working on it." Last night, he hadn't even replied. He just cut his steak, the silence loud enough to deafen her. She couldn't fail. She looked at her reflection in the darkened window of her office. The woman staring back was tired. The fear of being replaced, of being cast aside like an out-of-season coat, was a constant, cold hum in her veins. She pulled up her email client again. She had sent 3 standard inquiries, all ignored. She took a breath and typed a new subject line. Commission for Sterling Tower Headquarters, Victor Sterling. She didn't use her assistant's voice. She wrote it herself. She stripped away the corporate jargon. She wrote about the space, the light, the need for something that anchored the room. She used the vocabulary Lucas had taught her years ago, words about grain direction and tinsel strength, words she hadn't spoken in a decade. It felt like speaking a dead language. "We are not looking for furniture," she typed. "We are looking for a legacy." She hit send. Across town, in the glass cube suspended above the warehouse floor, a notification pinged on a laptop screen. Julia picked up her coffee and opened the email. She read it once. Then she read it again. She looked down at the workshop floor where Lucas was planing a piece of maple, his movements rhythmic and meditative. She knew exactly who Emily was. Lucas never spoke of her, but Julia had seen the way his jaw tightened when the Sterling Tower was mentioned on the news. She knew the history without ever having to ask for the details. Julia typed a reply. She didn't consult a calendar. Lucas had said, "If they come, I'll be ready." Back in the gallery, Emily's computer chimed. She clicked the message open so fast her hand shook. From J. Vance, studio director, to Emily Sterling, subject. Commission for Sterling Tower. Mrs. Sterling, LB, is willing to discuss the project. However, he does not do site visits. You will come to the studio. Tomorrow. 4 p.m. Sharp. Come alone. No assistants. No press. Address attached. Emily let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. She slumped back in her ergonomic chair, a wave of relief washing over her. She had done it. She had cracked the vault. She opened the attachment to check the address. She expected a loft in the West Loop, or maybe a converted space in River North, where the artists played at being gritty while drinking $10 lattes. She read the address, 4200 South Ashland Avenue, Building 4. Emily frowned. That wasn't an art district. That was the old packing district. It was deep industrial territory. Warehouses, meat packing plants, steel yards. It was a desolate, gray stretch of the city that most of her social circle pretended didn't exist. Why would the most sought-after designer in the world base himself there? A vague, uncomfortable memory scratched at the back of her mind. Lucas used to talk about that area. He used to say the old timber in those warehouses was better than anything you could buy new. He used to dream about having a space big enough to. She shook her head, dismissing the thought. Lucas was gone. He was probably fixing cabinets in some suburb, or maybe he had moved back to Ohio. He had nothing to do with this. LB was probably some eccentric sculptor who liked the texture of urban decay. It was a trend, she told herself. Poverty chic. She printed the address and put it in her purse. She would take the town car. She would wear her armor, the Chanel suit, the heels, the diamond studs. She would walk into that warehouse, negotiate the deal, and bring the contract back to Victor like a trophy. She dialed Victor's private line. "I got the meeting," she said when he answered. "Good," Victor replied. "Don't mess it up." The line went dead. Emily stared at the phone. She had the meeting. She had the address. But as she looked out at the city, she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't the hunter in this scenario. She felt, for the first time in years, like she was the prey walking willingly into a cage. The Lincoln Town car navigated the potholes of South Ashland Avenue like a sleek black shark swimming through a coral reef of rusted sedans and delivery trucks. Inside, the climate control was set to 70 degrees, but Emily felt a distinct chill radiating from the tinted windows. She checked her reflection in her compact mirror for the 10th time. Her lipstick was precise. Her platinum hair was immobile. She looked like exactly what she was, the wife of a billionaire, sent to acquire a luxury good. "This is the address, ma'am?" the driver asked, slowing down. He sounded skeptical. Emily looked out the window. They were in the heart of the old manufacturing district. The buildings here were massive, hulking beasts of red brick and blackened steel, remnants of a time when Chicago built the world. Most were boarded up, their windows like blind eyes staring at the gray sky. But then, she saw it. Building 4. It wasn't boarded up. It was a fortress. The brick had been sandblasted clean, revealing a deep, rich crimson. The windows were new, massive panes of industrial glass that reflected the clouds. The heavy steel doors were painted a matte black, devoid of graffiti. There was no sign, no billboard, just a small, discreet brass plaque next to the intercom. "LB, this is it," Emily said, her voice tight. She stepped out of the car. The wind here smelled different than it did in the Gold Coast. It smelled of diesel, wet pavement, and something else. Something faint but piercing. Fresh lumber. Resin. The smell of a forest cut open. It triggered a memory she didn't want. A memory of a small garage, of sawdust in her hair, of Lucas laughing as he tried to teach her how to sand a table leg. She shoved the memory down, burying it under layers of denial. "Wait here," she told the driver. She walked to the steel door and pressed the buzzer. There was no voice on the other end. Just a heavy, mechanical click, and the lock disengaged. Emily pushed the door open and stepped inside. She expected a lobby. She expected a receptionist behind a glass desk. Instead, she stepped into a cavernous foyer that felt more like a cathedral than a workshop. The ceilings were 30 feet high, crisscrossed with iron beams. The floor was polished concrete, smooth as glass. The space was silent, save for the distant, rhythmic hum of ventilation. Hanging on the walls were sketches, huge, charcoal drawings of joints, angles, and curves. They were architectural in their precision, but artistic in their flow. In the center of the room stood a single chair on a pedestal, lit by a spotlight. Emily walked toward it, her heels clicking loudly in the vast space. It was white oak. The design was simple, almost severe, but as she got closer, she saw the complexity. The way the legs joined the seat wasn't just construction. It was a conversation between the pieces of wood. It looked fluid. It looked alive. "Mrs. Sterling." The voice came from the shadows near a steel staircase. Emily jumped, spinning around. A woman stepped into the light. She was tall, wearing a charcoal jumpsuit and holding a tablet. Her hair was pulled back in a severe knot. She looked efficient, intelligent, and entirely unimpressed by Emily's Chanel suit. "I'm Julia Vance," the woman said, not extending a hand. Director of Operations. Ms. Vance, Emily said, regaining her composure. She flashed her gallery director smile, the one designed to disarm. A pleasure. This space is remarkable, very industrial chic. It's a workshop, Julia corrected flatly. We don't do chic. We do work. Emily's smile faltered. Of course. I'm here to see LB. My husband is very eager to discuss the commission. He knows, Julia said. She turned and began walking toward a set of double doors at the far end of the hall. Follow me. He's finishing a piece. He doesn't like to be kept waiting. Emily followed, struggling to keep pace in her stilettos. Does he always work this far south? It's quite a trek from the city center. Solitude is expensive, Mrs. Sterling, Julia said over her shoulder. And silence is rare. They reached the double doors. They were made of heavy, solid walnut, towering 10 feet high. The handles were hand-forged iron. Even the doors were a statement. Julia stopped. She turned to Emily, her expression unreadable. A few rules, Julia said. Do not touch anything unless he invites you to. Do not take photos. And do not waste his time with corporate speak. He speaks wood, not money. Emily bristled. I assure you, I know how to speak with artists. I run the Sterling Gallery. Julia's lips twitched, almost into a smirk. This isn't a gallery. It's a foundry. She pushed the heavy doors open. A wave of sound hit Emily, the high-pitched whine of a table saw slowing down, followed by the roar of a dust collector. The smell was stronger here, overpowering. Walnut, oak, oil, sweat. The room was massive, filled with millions of dollars of machinery. But Emily's eyes were drawn to the center of the room. A man stood at a massive assembly table, his back to her. He was wearing a dark gray t-shirt that clung to his back, stained with sweat. He wore heavy canvas work pants and boots. He was leaning over a blueprint, a pencil in his hand. He was broad-shouldered, powerful. The muscles in his arms shifted as he reached across the table to mark a measurement. Emily stopped breathing. There was something about the stance. Something about the way he held the pencil, gripping it strangely, between his index and middle finger, a habit she used to tease. The man didn't turn around immediately. He finished his mark. He set the pencil down with a deliberate, heavy click. Julia, the man said. His voice was deep, rougher than she remembered, tempered by age and smoke and silence. But it was him. The client is here, Julia said softly. The man turned slowly. He had a beard now, dark and neatly trimmed, hiding the jawline she used to kiss. His hair was shorter, flecked with gray at the temples. His face was harder, etched with lines that hadn't been there 7 years ago. But the eyes, those deep, thoughtful brown eyes, were exactly the same. Except they weren't looking at her with love. They were looking at her with absolutely nothing. Emily felt the floor drop out from under her. The air left her lungs. Her hand flew to her mouth, the diamond on her finger catching the harsh industrial light. Hello, Emily, Lucas said. The hum of the ventilation system seemed to roar in the silence that stretched between them. Emily stood frozen, her designer handbag slipping from her fingers to hit the concrete floor with a dull thud. She didn't look down. She couldn't tear her eyes away from the man standing on the other side of the assembly table. Lucas, she whispered. The name felt foreign on her tongue, a relic from a life she had buried under 7 years of champagne and denial. This is a joke. Is this a joke? Lucas didn't smile. He didn't frown. He simply picked up a rag and wiped a smudge of graphite from his fingertips. His movements were slow, deliberate, and terrifyingly calm. You requested a meeting, Mrs. Sterling, Lucas said. His voice was level, stripped of any emotional cadence. It was the voice of a man discussing a contract, not a reunion. I'm here. We have 30 minutes. But how? Emily stammered, taking a step forward. Her eyes darted around the cavernous studio, taking in the millions of dollars in equipment, the soaring ceilings, the assistants working in the distance. You were a carpenter. You fixed cabinets. And you were a gallery assistant, Lucas replied, his eyes finally locking onto hers. They were dark and hard, like polished obsidian. Things change, or at least some things do. The implication hung in the air, sharp as a chisel. He had changed. She was exactly the same, still chasing status, still defining herself by the man she stood next to. "I don't understand," Emily said, her voice trembling. She reached out, her hand hovering over the edge of the walnut table between them, instinctively seeking a connection. "Why didn't you tell me? Why hide behind initials?" "Please don't touch the wood," Lucas said sharply. Emily jerked her hand back as if she had been burned. "Oils from your skin can stain the raw grain," he explained, his tone clinical. "And I didn't hide. I just stopped shouting to be heard by people who weren't listening." He walked around the table, closing the distance between them but maintaining a barrier of invisible ice. He picked up a set of blueprints and slid them across the smooth surface toward her. "Your husband wants a conference table," Lucas said, shifting the topic to business with brutal efficiency. 40 feet. Black walnut. Live edge. No steel supports. He wants it to symbolize power and stability. "Is that correct?" Emily stared at him. She wanted to scream. She wanted to grab his shoulders and shake him, to force him to acknowledge the 10 years they had spent together, the nights they had shared, the way she had broken his heart. She wanted anger. She wanted hatred. Anything but this crushing, professional indifference. "Lucas, stop it," she hissed, her voice cracking. "Stop acting like I'm a stranger. I'm your wife. I was." "You were," Lucas agreed. "Now you represent Sterling Development. My fee for a piece of this scale is $200,000. Non-negotiable. 50% upfront. Delivery in 6 months. "Victor will pay double," Emily blurted out, falling back on the only language she now knew fluently, money. "He'll pay whatever you want. He just wants the best." Lucas laughed. It wasn't the bitter, broken laugh she remembered from the night he left. It was a short, dry sound. "I know he'll pay," Lucas said. "Money is the only thing men like Victor have. It's the only tool in their box." He leaned forward, placing his hands on the table, his face inches from hers. For a fleeting second, Emily thought he was going to kiss her or yell at her. Her heart hammered against her ribs. "But this isn't about money, Emily," he said softly. "It's about value. You stood in a ballroom 7 years ago and told the world I was a hobby. You laughed at my hands because they were dirty." He held up his hands. They were still scarred, still rough, but now they commanded respect. "These hands built this empire," he said. "And the irony is, now you're standing in my workshop, wearing a dress that cost more than my first car, begging me for a piece of wood to validate your husband's ego." Emily felt tears hot and stinging in her eyes. The shame was absolute. It wasn't just that he was successful. It was that he had succeeded because she had left him. Her cruelty had been the fuel. "I made a mistake," she whispered, the admission tearing out of her. "Lucas, I am so unhappy. Victor, he's cold. He treats me like an accessory." Lucas finished for her. He stood up straight, pulling away. "I know. That's why you chose him. You wanted to be displayed, Emily. You got exactly what you asked for." He turned his back on her, walking over to a shelf to retrieve a binder. "I'm happy for you," she lied, her voice shaking. "Really, you deserve this." Lucas paused. He didn't look back. "I didn't do it for you to be happy for me," he said. "I did it so I never had to rely on anyone's opinion of me ever again." He turned back, holding a contract. "Do you want the table or not?" Emily looked at the contract. Then she looked at Lucas. She realized then that there was no redemption here. There was no movie moment where he would sweep her into his arms and thank her for the motivation. There was only the cold, hard fact that she had traded a man who would have died for her for a man who merely paid for her. And the man standing in front of her was out of her league. Emily swallowed the lump in her throat. She needed this win. She needed to prove her utility to Victor. She couldn't leave empty-handed. "Yes, we want the table." "Good," Lucas said, tossing the contract onto the wood. "Sign at the bottom. Julia will handle the deposit." He turned and walked toward the back of the studio, not even watching her sign. "Lucas," she called out, desperate for one last look. He stopped but didn't turn. "Does he know?" she asked. "Does Victor know it's you?" "He doesn't care who I am," Lucas said, walking through the heavy walnut doors. He only cares that I'm expensive. The doors swung shut with a heavy, final thud, leaving Emily alone in the center of the cathedral, holding a pen that felt heavier than a sledgehammer. The ink was still wet on the page. Emily capped the heavy fountain pen, her hand trembling slightly. She had done it. She had secured the LB commission. It was a victory, a tangible, expensive piece of paper that she could hand to Victor to prove she was still useful, still relevant in his high-stakes world. "It's done," Emily said, her voice echoing in the vast, quiet workshop. She looked up, expecting Julia to step forward and take the binder. Instead, the steel doors at the back of the room opened again. Lucas walked back in. He wasn't holding tools this time. He was wiping his hands on a clean towel, his expression pensive. He walked past Emily as if she were a statue, stopping at the assembly table to look at the contract she had just signed. He stared at her signature, Emily Sterling, written in that practiced, elegant script he used to admire on birthday cards. Now, it looked like a corporate logo. "Julia," Lucas called out softly. Julia stepped out from the shadows near the office stairs. She moved with a quiet confidence that Emily envied. She didn't walk like a subordinate. She walked like an equal. "Process the deposit?" Julia asked, reaching for the binder. Lucas put his hand over the paper, stopping her. His broad, scarred hand covered Emily's signature completely. "No," Lucas said. Emily blinked, the relief in her chest instantly tightening into panic. "Excuse me? I signed it. The terms are agreed. 200,000. Non-negotiable." Lucas looked up at her. "I'm not accepting the commission." "You can't do that," Emily snapped, her voice rising an octave. "We have a verbal agreement. I just signed the contract. Victor is expecting this. He needs this." "Victor wants this," Lucas corrected calmly. "There is a difference. And looking at this signature, looking at where this table is going to end up, I realized something. I don't want my work in that building." He picked up the contract. With a slow, deliberate motion, he tore the heavy paper in half. Then he tore it again. The sound of ripping paper was violent in the quiet room. "Lucas," Emily gasped, stepping forward. "Do you have any idea what you're doing? You're throwing away a fortune. You're being petty." "Am I?" Lucas asked. He dropped the pieces of the contract into the waste bin near the table saw. "I build things to last, Emily. I build things with soul. Putting my work in Victor Sterling's tower would be like planting a tree in concrete. It would just die." "You're trying to punish me," she accused, tears of frustration welling in her eyes. "This is because of the gala. This is because I left." "No," a soft voice said from behind him. Julia stepped up next to Lucas. She placed a hand on his arm, a touch that was intimate, familiar, and possessive in the most natural way. Lucas didn't flinch. He leaned into her touch. It was the body language of two people who shared not just a workspace, but a life. "He's not punishing you, Mrs. Sterling," Julia said, her eyes kind but firm. "He just doesn't need the money. And we don't need the headache." Emily looked at Julia's hand on Lucas's arm. Then she looked at Lucas's left hand. He wasn't wearing a ring, but the way he looked at Julia, with a steady, grounded respect, was louder than any jewelry. Emily trailed off. "Julia is my wife," Lucas said simply, "and the co-owner of this studio. We make decisions together, and we decided we don't like the client." The word hung in the air. Wife. Emily felt the blood drain from her face. She looked at Julia. No makeup, simple clothes, working hands. And then she looked at Lucas, who looked more whole, more complete than he ever had in their penthouse. She realized then that she hadn't just lost a husband 7 years ago. She had lost a partner. She had traded a man who could build a world with his hands for a man who simply bought worlds others had built. "Please," Emily whispered, the fight draining out of her. "Victor he will be furious. I can't go back empty-handed." Lucas looked at her. For a moment, his expression softened, not into love, but into a distant pity. He saw the trap she was in. He saw the gilded cage. "That's not my problem anymore, Emily," he said. He turned to Julia. "I'm going to start the mill work on the library project. Are you coming?" "In a minute," Julia smiled. Lucas walked away. He didn't look back at Emily. He didn't offer a final goodbye. He just went back to work. Julia walked to the heavy steel front door and held it open. The wind from outside howled, carrying snow into the warm entryway. "You should go, Mrs. Sterling," Julia said gently. "Your driver is waiting." Emily stood there for a moment longer, clutching her expensive handbag, surrounded by the smell of sawdust and the warmth of a life she was too blind to value when she had it. She turned and walked toward the door. As she stepped across the threshold, the wind hit her. It was brutal, freezing, and sharp. The heavy steel door clanged shut behind her, the lock clicking into place with a sound like a gunshot. Emily stood on the sidewalk of South Ashland Avenue. The snow swirled around her, sticking to her eyelashes. Her town car was idling at the curb, a black hearse waiting to take her back to the glass tower, back to Victor, back to the cold perfection she had chosen. She shivered, pulling her coat tighter, but she knew the cold wasn't coming from the weather. It was coming from inside, deep in the hollow place where her heart used to be. She had traded a diamond for a piece of glass, and now, finally, she could feel the difference.